When a group of students storms into their teacher's wedding and halts the ceremony, the truth they reveal shocks everyone. Broken heart. What starts as heartbreak turns into a powerful journey of courage, redemption, and unexpected love. Set in Africa, this emotional story reminds us that sometimes, pain is just the beginning of peace. Globe showing Europe. Africa sparkles. It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. The church bells had begun to ring, the choir was already humming softly, and the scent of fresh roses filled the air. Everyone stood, watching as the bride, Miss Adora, a beloved secondary school teacher, walked down the aisle in her stunning white gown. But just before she could reach the altar, the heavy church doors burst open. A loud bang echoed through the hall. Every head turned. Gasps filled the air. And then, storming in, wearing their school uniforms and faces painted with tears and anger, came her students. Dozens of them. Some holding placards made of cardboard. Some still clutching their school bags. Others shouting words no one could understand at first. The crowd froze. The groom's smile vanished. The priest's hands trembled mid-air. And Miss Adora, she just stood there, her eyes wide, her bouquet shaking in her hands. Because she knew, whatever brought her students here today, it wasn't ordinary. For months, Adora had been preparing for this wedding. She was known as the Angel of Lighthaven High, a teacher with a soft heart and a sharp tongue when it came to discipline. She was that one teacher every student loved and feared at the same time. She stayed after school to help the slow learners, brought food for those who couldn't afford lunch, and even sold her phone once to pay a student's exam fees. But despite her kindness, there was one thing Adora never talked about, her relationship with Mr. Kelvin, the man she was about to marry. He was charming, successful, and rich enough to make her life easier. But something about him had always felt off. Her students had noticed it before she did. The way he looked down on them when he came to pick her up. The way he'd mock the broken desks and leaking ceilings of their classrooms. The way his laughter sounded, too cold, too fake. And then, one afternoon, 2 weeks before the wedding, something happened that changed everything. It began when Chisholm, one of Adora's brightest students, found a letter in the school compound. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, but it carried Adora's name at the top, written in shaky handwriting. Inside was a message that chilled her to the bone. He's not who you think he is. Don't marry him. Or you'll regret it forever. No signature. No clue. Just those words. At first, the students thought it was a prank. But then more things started to happen. Kelvin's car was seen parked outside the house of another woman, late at night. He yelled at one of Adora's students for touching his car. And when a parent came to school one day, crying that Kelvin had cheated her in a business deal, the students began to suspect something dark. So, they planned something crazy. Something no one had ever done before. They decided to stop the wedding. As they marched into the church that morning, whispers filled the air like wildfire. Some people tried to stop them. But the students kept walking forward until they stood right before the altar. One of them, Chisholm, stepped out, trembling but determined. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. The truth they were about to reveal would shatter every smile in that church. And for the first time, Adora realized that maybe, just maybe, her students had come not to destroy her happiness, but to save her from it. The crowd leaned in. The groom clenched his fists. The choir stopped singing. Because what came next was something nobody was ready for. The silence in the church was so deep that even the sound of breathing could be heard. The tension hung in the air like heavy smoke. Adora's eyes darted between her students and her groom, her mind spinning in confusion. "What is going on?" she wanted to ask, but her throat was dry. Then, one of the students stepped forward. It was Chisholm, the same bright girl who always sat in the front row and greeted her every morning with a shy smile. Today, that smile was gone. Her eyes were swollen, her voice trembling, yet firm. "Miss Adora," she began, "please don't marry him." The crowd gasped. Some people started murmuring. The groom, Mr. Kelvin, gave a forced laugh, cold and mocking. "What kind of nonsense is this?" he snapped. "Children. Do you even know what you're saying?" But the students didn't flinch. Another one, small and nervous-looking, spoke from behind Chisholm. "We know everything, sir. We saw what you did." The church fell into chaos. Adora's hand loosened, and her bouquet slipped to the ground. Her knees felt weak. She wanted to deny it, to tell them to stop, but a voice deep inside her whispered, "Listen." Just 3 days before the wedding, Chisholm and her classmates had gone to return borrowed costumes to the town's tailor shop. As they passed by a popular restaurant, they spotted Mr. Kelvin sitting at a corner table, holding another woman's hand. At first, they thought it was innocent, until they heard the woman call him, "my husband." They hid and listened. The conversation confirmed everything. Kelvin wasn't just cheating, he was already married. Married to a woman in another town. The students couldn't believe it. The man their teacher loved, the man she was about to pledge her life to, was a liar. They followed him secretly after that day. They saw him enter a different house each evening. They even caught him arguing with men over money. The night before the wedding, one of the students snuck into his car at the hotel parking lot, and found documents hidden inside his briefcase. Land titles. Fake business receipts. And photos of women. Mr. Kelvin wasn't who he claimed to be. He was a con artist who targeted women with stable jobs, teachers, nurses, widows, tricking them into marriage, then vanishing with their money. And now, his latest target was standing at the altar, Miss Adora. The priest's face paled. People in the church began whispering, "Jesus. Is this true?" Adora's breath hitched. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought she might faint. Kelvin tried to speak, to defend himself, but his voice broke under pressure. Sweat rolled down his forehead. "This is ridiculous. They're children. How could you believe?" But just then, the church door opened again. A woman walked in. Middle-aged. Elegant. Dressed in simple Ankara. And she was holding something, a framed wedding photo. "Because," she said, her voice steady and cold, "I am his wife." The crowd gasped again. Adora froze. Her mind went blank. Every dream she had about a happy marriage, shattered in one single moment. Kelvin's face turned pale as the woman walked closer and placed the picture in Adora's hands. It was him, standing beside her in a wedding suit, years ago. The hall went wild. The students began crying. Some clapped, others shouted, and a few just stood frozen. Adora didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there, silent, as tears began to slide down her cheeks. And then, slowly, she turned to her students, and smiled weakly. "Thank you," she whispered. Because deep down, she realized, those children she had taught to read and write had just saved her from a lifetime of regret. The priest quietly dismissed the ceremony. The guests began to leave. But the story had only just begun. Because the next day, something unexpected happened that would turn Adora's heartbreak into something far greater. The next morning, the news had spread like wildfire across the town. Everyone was talking about the teacher whose student stopped her wedding. Some called it bravery. Others called it disgrace. But for Miss Adora, it felt like living through a storm that wouldn't stop. She had barely slept. Her white gown lay crumpled in the corner, stained with tears and dust. The makeup she had worn with pride just hours ago was now a faint memory on her swollen face. The woman she had been, the hopeful bride, was gone. What was left was silence, confusion, and heartbreak. Outside her small apartment, reporters and curious neighbors whispered. Some pitied her, others mocked her. Imagine being dumped at the altar by your own students, someone sneered. What a shame. But Adora wasn't ashamed. She was hurt, yes, but not broken. She kept remembering the faces of her students, the trembling hands, the fear in their eyes when they marched into the church. That wasn't rebellion. That was love. Later that afternoon, she went back to the school, not as a teacher, but as a woman who needed answers. When she entered the classroom, the students froze. Some looked away, afraid she might be angry. But Adora just smiled softly. Come here, she said. Her voice was calm, almost motherly. The children gathered around her. She could see how tired they looked, how scared they still were. Chisholm's eyes were red from crying. Adora knelt beside her and whispered, "You did the right thing." At that moment, the tension in the room melted. Tears flowed freely, students crying, hugging her, apologizing for ruining her big day. But Adora shook her head. "You didn't ruin anything," she said, "you saved me." Then something unexpected happened. The school principal entered, holding a newspaper. He looked serious, but there was pride in his eyes. "Miss Adora," he said quietly, "the Ministry of Education heard what happened. They're impressed by your dedication and your students' courage. They want to meet you." The words hit her like sunlight through a storm. The same event that almost destroyed her life, was now opening doors she never imagined. Within days, the story reached national radio. People across the country spoke about her. Some said her students represented the new generation of truth seekers. Others praised Adora for teaching her students to be bold and stand for what's right. But while the world praised her, Adora's heart was still heavy. Nights were lonely. She missed the dream she once had, to build a family, to love, to be loved in return. Still, she tried to find peace in one truth: sometimes, God breaks your heart to save your soul. A week later, as she stood outside the classroom, watching her students laugh and run around during break, she felt something she hadn't felt in days: warmth. One of her students, little Tund, ran up to her with a small wrapped gift. "Ma," he said shyly, "we all put our lunch money together to buy this for you." She opened it, and found a small necklace inside, handmade with beads and thread. On the pendant were tiny words scribbled in pen, "To the best teacher in the world." Adora broke down crying. Not because she was sad anymore, but because she realized that love doesn't always come from where you expect. Sometimes, it comes from the hearts of those you least imagine. That day, she made a promise to herself. She would no longer be defined by heartbreak. She would rise from it. And she did. She began mentoring other young teachers, traveling to schools across Nigeria, telling her story, not of humiliation, but of courage, faith, and second chances. Sometimes, the ones you teach end up teaching you. And sometimes, when life stops you from walking down one aisle, it's only because there's a better path waiting ahead. Months passed, and the story of the wedding that never happened slowly became part of the town's folklore. People no longer whispered behind Miss Adora's back, they greeted her with respect. She was no longer the woman who got betrayed, but the woman who stood tall after heartbreak. Still, deep inside her, a quiet ache remained. Some nights she would sit by her window, watching the streetlights flicker, wondering how different life could have been if love had gone as planned. But then she'd smile faintly and whisper to herself, maybe God just wanted to write a better story. One morning, Adora received a letter at school. It was sealed with an unfamiliar emblem, the Ministry of Education's official stamp. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was an invitation to speak at a teachers' conference in Abuja. The theme? Raising a Fearless Generation. Her eyes widened. For the first time since that fateful day, she felt something spark in her heart again: purpose. She spent nights preparing her speech, not as a victim, but as a woman who had found strength in pain. When she finally stood before hundreds of teachers from across the country, her voice didn't shake. She spoke about honesty, about the power of nurturing young minds, and about how courage doesn't always roar, it sometimes whispers, "This is wrong." By the time she finished, the hall erupted in applause. Journalists rushed to take her story again, and for the first time, she smiled with pride, not as someone who was pitied, but as someone who had inspired. After the event, a man approached her. He was quiet, tall, with kind eyes that carried warmth instead of charm. He introduced himself as Mr. Santo, a lecturer in the same conference, specialized in educational psychology. "I read about your story," he said softly. "It wasn't just about heartbreak, it was about transformation. You reminded me why I started teaching." Adora smiled shyly, not sure what to say. She had forgotten what it felt like to have a genuine conversation that wasn't shadowed by pity or gossip. They spoke for hours that evening, exchanging thoughts about teaching, youth, and the small joys that came from changing lives. For once, she didn't feel broken. She felt seen. Weeks passed, and Mr. Santo became a quiet presence in Adora's life. He wasn't flashy, didn't make big promises, and never spoke in sweet riddles. Instead, he listened. He made her laugh again, gently, like sunshine after rain. But Adora was cautious. Love had burned her once. She feared getting close again. She told herself she didn't need another man, that her students, her work, and her faith were enough. Until one evening, after a teacher training workshop, she returned home to find her students gathered outside her apartment, smiling mischievously. "Ma, someone left this for you," Chisholm said, handing her a small brown box tied with a blue ribbon. Adora frowned, curious, and opened it. Inside was a simple pen, engraved with her name, and a note that read, "You use this pen to teach others how to write their future. Now it's time to write yours again. Santo." Her chest tightened. Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness, but from something warmer, gentler. That night, she wrote in her journal for the first time in months. "Maybe love doesn't always come with flowers and fancy rings. Sometimes, it comes quietly, like a friend who reminds you that your story isn't over yet." As she closed her journal and looked out through her window, she saw the moon reflecting on the quiet streets. Somewhere in that stillness, she realized she wasn't waiting for love anymore. Because love, real love, had already found her in the most unexpected form, through the courage of her students, the lessons of heartbreak, and the healing of time. Healing is not forgetting, it's remembering without pain. And sometimes, the greatest love stories aren't about weddings, but about rediscovering yourself after the storm. A full year had passed since the day the wedding stopped. The old church bell that once rang for Adora's ceremony now chimed for another couple, but this time, Adora didn't feel pain. She smiled as she walked past, holding a stack of exam scripts in one hand and a basket of oranges in the other. Her life had found rhythm again. Peaceful, steady, and deeply fulfilling. She had become more than just a teacher, she was now a mentor to teachers across the region, a voice of integrity in education. But what made her proudest wasn't the awards or invitations, it was still her students. They had grown braver, more confident, more outspoken. Whenever she looked at them, she saw the faces of children who had once stormed into a church to save her life. And in every one of them, she saw a piece of her redemption. One Friday afternoon, after her last class, she stood beneath the big mango tree behind the school, the same tree where she often marked papers and gave advice to her pupils. The sunset poured gold across the compound, and laughter from the students echoed in the air. Then, quietly, a familiar voice spoke behind her. "You still like grading under this tree, don't you?" Adora turned. It was Mr. Santo. He was holding 2 bottles of Zobo and wearing that same calm smile she had come to recognize anywhere. She laughed softly. Old habits die hard. They sat together in comfortable silence, sipping the chilled drink as the sky turned orange and purple. For a long time, neither spoke. There was no rush. No tension. Just peace. Finally, Santo said, "You know, Adeora, you've changed so many lives, including mine. You've shown that strength isn't about pretending to be fine, it's about standing tall when the ground gives way." She looked at him, eyes glistening. "And you've taught me that sometimes, second chances don't come dressed as love stories. They come as gentle friendships that grow quietly." Santo smiled. "Then maybe it's time to let that friendship grow fully." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small wrapped box, not fancy, not glittery, just simple. Adeora froze. Her heart thudded. "Santo. Relax," he chuckled softly, "it's not another wedding proposal." She laughed, relieved and curious, as she opened the box. Inside was a small gold brooch shaped like an open book. Engraved on it were the words, "For the woman who turned heartbreak into history." Adeora's breath caught. She didn't cry this time. She simply smiled, holding the brooch against her heart. Weeks later, she wore that brooch as she stood before her students on graduation day. Her voice carried warmth, pride, and peace. "My children," she said, "life will test you. It will embarrass you, break your heart, even make you question your worth. But never forget, sometimes, disappointment is God's protection in disguise." The hall was silent as her words sank deep. "Don't chase people who walk away." She continued. "Chase purpose. Chase growth. And one day, when you least expect it, peace will find you again." Her students stood and clapped. Some cried. Chisholm, now head girl, presented her with flowers, fresh sunflowers, Adeora's favorite. As she hugged the girl tightly, she whispered, "You were my saving grace." That evening, as she locked her classroom for the last time that term, Adeora stood under the sunset once more. She smiled at the empty schoolyard, the echoes of laughter fading in the breeze. Her story had started with a ruined wedding, but it ended with freedom, wisdom, and love that didn't need a ceremony. Because in the end, Miss Adeora didn't just teach lessons. She became one. Moral of the story. Sometimes, the worst heartbreak is the doorway to your greatest peace. When people walk out, it's because destiny needs space to walk in. The END, please like and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.